Henry Perkins had been a plumber in his small town for over 20 years, but this year had been the hardest of them all. The rising cost of living and competition from a big-name plumbing company offering flashy discounts had left him scrambling to make ends meet. At 45, Henry's dreams of owning his own home or saving for retirement had faded into a daily battle to pay rent and put food on the table. Despite it all, Henry took pride in his work. Every pipe he fixed, every faucet he tightened, it wasn't just about making a living. It was about helping people. Henry never left a leak unfixed, even if it meant staying late into the night or accepting a meal in lieu of payment. Still, the strain was beginning to show. His tools were worn, his truck was barely running, and his bills were piling up. One icy Tuesday morning, Henry sat in his drafty apartment, sipping the last of his coffee. He flipped through his planner, which had more blank spaces than jobs. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But instinct told him to pick up. "Perkins Plumbing." "Henry speaking," he said, his voice hoarse from a lingering cold. A frail yet polite voice responded. "Good morning. My name is Walter. My kitchen sink is leaking something fierce, and I don't know how to fix it. Could you come by today?" Henry glanced at his nearly empty schedule. "I can be there by noon," he replied. When Henry pulled up to the address, he was struck by the modesty of the home. The weathered siding and peeling paint spoke of years gone by, but the porch was lovingly adorned with wind chimes and potted plants, now bare from the winter cold. A frail older man opened the door before Henry could knock, his thin frame bundled in a thick cardigan. "You must be Mr. Perkins," Walter said with a warm smile. His face was lined with deep creases, his eyes kind but tired. "That's me," Henry said, extending a hand. "Let's take a look at that sink." Inside, the house was cozy but cluttered, its shelves overflowing with books and framed photographs. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the warmth from an old radiator. Walter led Henry into the kitchen, where water dripped steadily from the base of the faucet, pooling on the counter. "I tried tightening it," Walter said, gesturing to the sink, "but my hands aren't as steady as they used to be." "No problem," Henry replied, rolling up his sleeves. "I'll get this sorted out for you." As Henry worked, he chatted with Walter, learning that he had lived in the house for over 40 years. Walter shared that he was a retired librarian who had lost his wife, Margaret, 5 years ago. They had no children, and his days were now spent reading, tending a small garden, and working through crossword puzzles. "It's not a bad life," Walter said with a hint of sadness. "But this house, it's starting to show its age. I can't keep up with all the repairs anymore." Henry nodded as he replaced a worn-out washer in the faucet. "Old houses have a lot of character, but they're demanding. I'll get this fixed so it doesn't give you any more trouble." Within half an hour, the leak was gone, and Henry wiped down the counter to leave it tidy. "All done," he said, packing up his tools. Walter looked relieved but hesitant as he reached for his wallet. I don't mean to trouble you, but I'm on a fixed income. Would you mind if I mailed the payment next week?" Henry saw the worry etched in Walter's face and felt a pang of understanding. He knew what it was like to juggle expenses. "Don't worry about it," Henry said with a kind smile. "This one's on the house." Walter's eyes widened. "Are you sure? That's very generous of you." "It wasn't a big job," Henry replied, shrugging. "I'm just glad I could help." Walter insisted that Henry stay for a cup of tea. Reluctantly, Henry accepted, taking a seat at the small, well-worn kitchen table. As they sipped their tea, Henry shared some of his own struggles, how work had slowed down, and how he worried about paying the rent on his tiny apartment. Walter listened intently, his hands folded around his mug, his face soft with understanding. "Times are tough," Henry said finally. "But you just keep going, right?" Walter nodded thoughtfully. "My wife always used to say kindness is a garden. If you tend it well, it'll grow when you least expect it. When Henry left that afternoon, he felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. The job hadn't paid a dime, but something about Walter's quiet gratitude made him feel richer than he had in months. Over the next week, Henry went back to his usual routine of clogged drains and faulty heaters, but Walter's words stayed with him. The kindness Henry had extended felt like it had started something, a small spark of hope amid the struggles. One rainy afternoon, just as Henry was finishing a particularly messy repair, his phone buzzed again. It was Walter. "Henry, I hate to bother you," Walter said, his voice apologetic. "But my bathroom faucet is acting up now. Would you mind taking a look?" Henry thought about the stack of bills on his kitchen counter but quickly pushed the thought aside. "I'll be there first thing tomorrow," he said. The next morning, Henry arrived at Walter's home, the frost on the grass crunching under his boots. Walter greeted him with his usual warm smile, though there was a hint of embarrassment in his posture as he opened the door. "Henry, I feel bad calling you again," Walter admitted, leading him toward the bathroom. "I hope I'm not taking up too much of your time." "You're never a bother," Henry said. "This is what I do. Let's take a look." The bathroom faucet had seen better days. Its handles were tarnished, and they creaked stubbornly when Henry turned them. Walter stood by the doorway, watching with a mix of admiration and curiosity as Henry began to work. "You're quick with those tools," Walter remarked. Henry chuckled. "Years of practice. I started as an apprentice when I was 18. Back then, I had big plans, thought I'd grow a big plumbing business, hire a team, maybe even retire early. But well, life has a way of rewriting the script." Walter nodded, leaning against the doorframe for support. "I know that feeling all too well. My wife and I had dreams of traveling the world once I retired from the library. She wanted to see Paris, I had my heart set on Italy. But her health started declining, and we never got the chance. I wouldn't trade a second of the time I spent with her, but it does make you think." "About what?" Henry asked, tightening the final connection. "About how the unexpected can sometimes bring its own blessings," Walter said. "Even when plans don't work out." Henry paused, turning Walter's words over in his mind. Despite the struggles he faced, he realized he still had something valuable, his skill, which allowed him to help others in ways most people couldn't. Once the faucet was fixed, Walter asked Henry to stay for lunch. Henry hesitated, knowing he had other jobs to finish that day, but something about Walter's genuine smile made it hard to refuse. Lunch was simple, a steaming bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, but the conversation made it feel special. Walter shared stories from his days as a librarian, describing how he and Margaret had spent weekends volunteering at a community garden. "She used to say, 'Kindness doesn't just make the world better, it makes life worth living,'" Walter recalled, his voice soft with memory. That garden wasn't just about plants. It was about people, connecting over something simple but meaningful. "I think that's why I enjoy having you here, Henry. It reminds me of those days." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. "It's just the right thing to do," he said, brushing off the compliment. As the days turned into weeks, Walter called Henry for a few more small repairs: a wobbly banister, a drafty window, a cabinet that wouldn't close properly. Each time, Walter insisted on offering tea or a meal, and the two men grew closer with every visit. Walter's home, once so quiet, was now filled with the warmth of laughter and conversation. One snowy evening, Henry had just finished tightening a loose doorknob when he slumped into Walter's armchair, visibly exhausted. Walter studied him closely, his brow furrowed in concern. "Henry, you've been working awfully hard lately. Are you taking care of yourself?" Walter asked. Henry hesitated, then sighed. "Truth is, I'm barely keeping up. Between the bills, the rent, and groceries, it feels like I'm treading water. I love what I do, but some days I wonder if it's enough." Walter leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "You've been a blessing to me, Henry. I only wish there was something I could do to help you. You've already done more than enough, Henry said with a tired smile. Knowing I've made things easier for you, it's worth it. Walter nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to a photograph of his late wife on the mantel. That evening, after Henry left, Walter sat in his living room, the faint hum of the radiator filling the silence. He looked at the photograph of Margaret and thought about the small savings account they had set aside for emergencies. This is what you'd want, Walter whispered, as if speaking to her. To use what we have to bring a little light to someone else's life. A few days later, Henry returned to Walter's house to fix a creaky cabinet door. Winter had fully settled over the town, blanketing everything in snow, but Henry barely noticed the cold as he stepped onto Walter's porch. He had come to look forward to these visits, not just for the work but for the warm company and steady friendship they had built. Inside, Walter was waiting with a cup of tea, the kitchen filled with the aroma of fresh bread. Henry accepted the tea with a grateful nod before getting to work on the cabinet. As he adjusted the hinges, he noticed Walter sitting quietly at the table, hands folded in his lap. You look deep in thought, Henry said, tightening the last screw. Walter glanced up and smiled faintly. I've been thinking about what you told me the other night, about how hard it's been for you lately. Henry shrugged, trying to downplay it. It's just how things are. I'll figure it out, like always. Walter leaned forward slightly. Do you remember what I told you about Margaret? How she believed kindness was a garden? Henry nodded, resting his hands on the countertop. She used to say that when someone helps you, you should find a way to pass it on, to pay it forward, Walter said. And I think it's my turn to do that for you. Henry blinked in surprise. Walter, you've already done so much for me. Those lunches, the conversations. Walter raised a hand, cutting him off gently. I'm not talking about meals or chats. I've thought this through, Henry. Margaret would have wanted this. And so do I. Henry opened his mouth to protest, but Walter's expression stopped him. There was a quiet resolve in his eyes, the kind that left no room for argument. Later that evening, Walter sat at his desk, pulling out an old stationery set that Margaret had once used for writing letters. His hands trembled slightly as he penned the words, pouring his gratitude and admiration for Henry into every sentence. Once the letter was complete, he reached for his checkbook and carefully wrote out the amount, $2,500, the bulk of the savings he and Margaret had set aside for emergencies. The next day, Walter mailed the envelope. 2 weeks later, Henry was sitting in his tiny apartment, surrounded by the usual chaos of unpaid bills and repair invoices. Despite his long hours, the work had barely been enough to keep him afloat. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, when a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find a small package on the doorstep, his name written neatly on the front. Curious, he brought it inside and tore open the envelope. What he found inside made his heart stop. A handwritten letter from Walter rested on top of a check for $2,500. Henry stared at the check, his hands trembling, before turning his attention to the letter. Dear Henry, you've been a light in a dark time for me, and I don't think I can ever repay the kindness you've shown me. But Margaret always believed that when you're given a blessing, you should share it with others. This small token isn't just a thank you, it's a reminder that you are making a difference, even when it doesn't always feel like it. Use this however you need to. And please don't think twice about it. Margaret and I were fortunate to save a little over the years, and I know this is exactly what she would want me to do. You've reminded me that kindness is alive and well in the world. Keep spreading it. With gratitude. Walter. Henry read the letter twice, tears blurring his vision. He had been honest with Walter about his struggles, but he never imagined this. The check in his hand wasn't just money, it was a lifeline, a symbol of trust, and a reminder that his work mattered. He grabbed his phone and dialed Walter's number. Walter answered on the second ring. Henry. What a nice surprise. Walter, Henry began, his voice shaking. "I don't even know what to say. It's too much." "No," Henry Walter interrupted gently. "It's exactly enough, and don't think of it as charity. Think of it as one person believing in another." Henry swallowed hard, overwhelmed with gratitude. "I'll make this count." The first promise. "I know you will," Walter said warmly. That night, Henry sat at his kitchen table, the letter and check still in front of him. For the first time in months, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He could catch up on his rent, pay down some bills, and even replace a few of his worn-out tools. But more than that, Walter's gesture reignited something in him, a belief in the goodness of people and the power of kindness. In the days that followed, Henry used Walter's generous gift to catch up on overdue rent and pay off a stack of bills that had been weighing him down for months. For the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe easier. But it wasn't just the financial relief that made a difference. Walter's kindness had sparked something in Henry, a desire to spread the same generosity that had lifted him out of a difficult time. The next week, Henry visited a single mother whose kitchen sink had been clogged for weeks. When she hesitated to approve the repair, nervously explaining that she couldn't afford it, Henry surprised her. "Don't worry about the cost," he said. "Consider it taken care of." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she thanked him, her young daughter peeking out from behind her with a shy smile. For Henry, the joy of helping her far outweighed the loss of payment. Soon after, Henry found himself offering to fix a heater at cost for an elderly woman who couldn't afford a full repair. Another day, he helped a neighbor move heavy furniture after repairing their water heater. Each act of kindness reminded him of Walter's words, "Kindness is a garden. If you tend it well, it grows when you least expect it." In the meantime, Henry continued visiting Walter regularly, their bond growing stronger with each visit. Walter's home, once quiet and lonely, now felt alive with warmth and laughter. On one visit, Walter surprised Henry by pulling out an old photograph album. "These are from my days with Margaret," Walter said, carefully opening the worn cover. Henry flipped through the pages, marveling at the black and white snapshots of Walter and Margaret in their youth. One photograph showed the two of them standing in a vibrant community garden, their smiles radiant under the summer sun. Another captured a moment in a library, Walter leaning over a desk to help a young child pick out a book. "You two really had something special," Henry said, his voice tinged with awe. "We did," Walter replied, his fingers brushing lightly over the page. "Margaret always said life isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. That's why she loved the garden so much. It wasn't just about growing plants, it was about growing connections." Henry nodded, feeling the truth of those words. "You've been like that for me, Walter. You've given me more than I could ever ask for." Walter smiled, his eyes glistening. "It's not just me, Henry, it's you too. You've brought life back into this house. I haven't felt this useful, or this alive in years." Spring came to the small town, bringing the first signs of new life. Crocuses pushed their way through patches of thawing snow, and Walter's once dormant rose bushes began to sprout new buds. Henry continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by Walter's example. He started a simple website for his business, using an old laptop he had repaired himself. The site included a new feature called Pay It Forward projects, where he offered discounted or free repairs for people in need, funded by small contributions from customers who wanted to give back. To his surprise, the response was immediate. Clients shared the website on social media, and neighbors began spreading the word. Donations started trickling in, along with messages from people inspired by his story. A local hardware store owner even offered to supply discounted materials for the projects. One message stood out in particular. It was from a woman whose late husband had also been a tradesman. "Your story reminds me of how he always went the extra mile for people," she wrote. "I'd love to help. Let me know if there's anything I can do." The small acts of kindness rippled outward, drawing in more people who wanted to contribute. It felt like a continuation of what Walter and Margaret had started years ago in their garden, a community built on generosity and connection. One sunny afternoon, Henry showed up at Walter's house with a bag of groceries. "Thought you might like a few things," Henry said, setting the bag on the counter. Walter chuckled. "You didn't have to do that. But I won't say no to a little company. Come on in." Over tea, Henry shared the news about his Pay It Forward projects and the growing support from the community. Walter listened with a proud smile, his hands wrapped around his mug. "That's exactly what Margaret meant when she talked about the ripple effect of kindness," Walter said. "You're not just fixing pipes, Henry, you're mending lives." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. "I don't think I would have seen it that way if it weren't for you, Walter. What you did for me. It changed everything." Walter reached across the table and patted Henry's hand. "All I did was remind you of what you already had in you. The rest was all you." That night, Henry drove home feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He thought about how much had changed since his first visit to Walter's house. His business was still small, and the bills didn't stop coming, but he no longer felt weighed down by the struggle. Walter's gift had been the turning point, but it was the kindness that followed, the conversations, the shared meals, the sense of community that had truly transformed him. Summer arrived in the small town, draping everything in golden light. Walter's house, once marked by wear and quiet solitude, now felt transformed. The creaky steps had been fixed, the banisters no longer wobbled, and the drafts that once crept through the windows had been sealed. But the real transformation wasn't in the repairs, it was in the laughter and connection that now filled the home. One Saturday afternoon, Henry was working on Walter's porch, replacing a section of the railing that had rotted over the years. Walter stepped outside with 2 glasses of iced tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. "You've turned this old house into a home again," Walter said, handing Henry a glass. Henry wiped the sweat from his brow and smiled. "It's your home, Walter. I'm just here to help." Walter sat down on a chair by the porch, looking out over his yard. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about Margaret lately," he said, his voice warm but wistful. "She had a gift for spotting the good in people. And you, Henry, you remind me so much of her." Henry felt his chest tighten. "That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's true," Walter said. "And it's why I'm going to do one last thing for you." Henry looked at him, confused. "Walter, you've already done more than enough. That check changed my life, and everything you've shared with me, the meals, the conversations, it means the world to me." Walter's expression was firm but kind. "This isn't about what I've done, it's about what you've done. You've touched more lives than you realize, Henry, and it's time for the people you've helped to show you how much you mean to them." Later that week, Walter made some quiet calls to neighbors, friends, and clients whose lives had been touched by Henry's work. He explained his idea, and within days the plan came together. The following Sunday, Henry received a call from Walter. "Can you stop by? Something urgent's come up," Walter said cryptically. Henry arrived a few hours later, puzzled to see several cars parked outside Walter's house. When he stepped inside, he was met by a crowd of familiar faces, neighbors, clients, and even a few strangers whose names he didn't know but whose smiles told him they were there for a reason. "Walter," Henry said, his voice laced with confusion. "What's going on?" Walter stepped forward with a wide grin. "You've spent so much of your life helping others, Henry. It's time we returned the favor." One by one, people stepped forward to share how Henry's kindness had made a difference in their lives. A single mother spoke about how Henry had repaired her heater during the winter, without charging her a penny. An elderly woman tearfully recounted how Henry had stayed late to patch her roof before an oncoming storm. A young couple, new to the town, shared how Henry had fixed their water heater at cost when they couldn't afford the full repair. Walter held up a glass jar filled with bills and coins. "We've all chipped in to give you a little something extra," he said. "Consider it a thank you from the community you've been holding together." Henry stared at the jar, his hands trembling. The room was filled with applause. But all Henry could do was shake his head, overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just say you'll keep being you," Walter said with a wink. After the gathering, Henry and Walter sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. The golden light bathed the yard, where Walter's rose bushes had burst into full bloom. "You've given me more than I ever expected," Walter Henry said, his voice full of emotion. Walter shook his head. "No, Henry, you gave first. All I did was follow your example." From that day forward, Henry's life began to flourish in ways he never imagined. His business grew steadily, bolstered by the community's support and his reputation as a man who not only fixed pipes but also mended hearts. The Pay It Forward projects became a cornerstone of his work, allowing him to help even more people in need. Walter, too, found new joy in his days. His once quiet home was now filled with visitors, neighbors who came to chat, friends who came to help tend his garden, and Henry, who never let more than a week pass without stopping by. In his quiet moments, Walter often looked at the photograph of Margaret on the mantel. "We've planted a beautiful garden, my dear," he would whisper to her. "And it's still growing." Henry, too, carried Walter and Margaret's philosophy of kindness wherever he went. Every act of generosity, every small repair done for someone in need, felt like a continuation of the seed Walter had planted in him. Years later, as Henry's own life blossomed with new opportunities, he would often tell the story of a man named Walter, a man who taught him that kindness isn't just something you give. It's something you grow. And as the garden of kindness spread across their small town, it became clear that one simple act of compassion could transform not just one life, but many.